Welcome everybody, my name's Ian Allington. I'm the president of Manchester Trades Council, Manchester TUC, which is the kind of umbrella group for trade unionists across the city. This evening's meeting, we're discussing post-pandemic possibilities for the working class. We really wanted to have a discussion now, even though for most of us we're very much grappling still with the problems caused by the pandemic, both the health and safety, the public health aspects, also the economic aspects of it. It's clear we need to be thinking at the same time about what comes after the pandemic. Are we going to be seeing working class people faced with paying a bill for the huge bailouts of business that have gone on? Are we going to go back to the kind of normal that produced this crisis in the first place? Or are we going to see a very different sort of society where caring for people and public services are properly funded, where actually we don't have austerity? We've seen the power that government has to intervene when it's motivated to do so. So we've got two great speakers this evening to kick the discussion off. We've got Peter Middleman from the Northwest TUC, who recently produced a document called Aims for a Post-Pandemic Workers' Consensus, which is mainly looking at workers' rights side of things. And we've got Billy Godfrey from the Great Manchester Labour for a Green New Deal, who are obviously campaigning to try and make sure that there are lots of sustainable jobs rather than going back to necessarily the jobs that we had before this crisis. So over to you, Peter.
Good evening, comrades. Thanks very much, Ian, for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation as well. This is, I think, the third or fourth Trades Council meeting that me or the fellow officers of the Northwest TUC have addressed on this subject now. We've already spoken at Lancashire, at Stockport. I think Cheshire, West and Chester is in the diary. Lancaster and Morecambe is in the diary. I'm particularly pleased to be, I'm not just flattering you here, but the Manchester TUC is recognised as one of the most active. That's very evident. I've seen some of your excellent May Day Zoom earlier on in the week in preparing for this meeting. And I'll begin by just giving a bit of a background to the paper. But I'm Vice Chair of the Northwest TUC, but I joined the TUC initially, Northwest TUC, as a delegate from Merseyside County Association and a delegate from Liverpool. So I'm acutely aware of the value of what trades councils can bring to this debate, and I will finish actually on some further reflections in that respect. But it was in preparing for the lockdown really that a handful of regional secretaries, because my day job is regional secretary of the National Education Union, got together, and it was initially talking about what sort of reciprocal practical arrangements we could put in place to support each other through the crisis, with staff working and living in different parts of the region and different pieces of work being required in different parts of the region. Once the lockdown was confirmed, however, that soon began to generate a discussion in anticipation of exactly the types of phenomena that Ian mentioned in his introduction about if every crisis is an opportunity for the ruling class, then every crisis should be an opportunity for us as well. And you know, you have to say the TUC got off to a reasonably strong start in that respect. Negotiations including Francis O'Grady and others around the furlough scheme, which has guaranteed the incomes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of workers, but is running up a bill, if you consider it in the traditional sense, running into the billions of pounds. And I'll return to that as well. Excuse me, I've got a bit of hay fever. Ian said that the paper focuses mainly on workers' rights, and it's true that does feature quite heavily in it. But what we wanted to do was to get the TUC into a position, accepting all the limitations that operating within the TUC's parameters brings, and we might come back to that in questions perhaps. But just to get ahead of the game, the paper was drafted in early May. I was asked to produce the first draft after an initial meeting of officers, but it's been amended and adopted by the officers, by the executive and by the regional council since. So it is official Northwest TUC position at the moment. But it's only words on a page, and if we don't give life to it, then it'll just gather dust and go nowhere. So without, hopefully you've read through. I'm not going to read it or speak to the document itself in too much detail, other than to say that the themes were around accepting that the paper is written from a unashamedly optimistic perspective to begin with, recognising the progress that we made early on, recognising some of the organic organising that was taking place. Certainly noticed it in schools. It was certainly evident in the health sector, in the care sector as well, and workers who were perhaps for the first time being recognised outside of their own circles and outside of organised labour by the wider population and the wider economy. You know, if they, it says in the paper, when they produced that list of key workers, hedge fund managers weren't on it, were they? But shop, distributive, sanitation, health care, education, and so on, all were. And it's really trying to lay some foundations for workers in those sectors, whether organised or unorganised, whether trade union members or not trade union members, to try to take some confidence from that newfound accepted mainstream status and begin to punch their weight as we emerge from the crisis. So there's an emphasis in there on workers' rights. Anyone who's heard me speak on platforms such as this over the last couple of years will have heard me mention the fact that last year obviously was the bicentenary of Peterloo, where we celebrated a leap forward for working class democracy. That democracy hasn't yet translated itself in enough places, in workplaces, however. It was also the centenary of the establishment of the ILO last year, which we celebrated. We've had 70 years of rights to organise and to bargain collectively, but still, largely because of the hostility of the national government, we haven't made the breakthroughs that we would like. Private sector union density levels if they're double-digit figures, they're very low, double-digit figures, and that needs to change. Informed to a certain extent by some of the Labour Party manifesto commitments, particularly around the Progressive Industrial Relations Bill and the focus that provided on sectoral bargaining and establishment bargaining, and the need to, if not directly lobby the government for that, but at least keep the Labour Party honest on that particular issue in the post-Corbyn era. So there's a section also on employment security and flexible work, and recognising that just as meetings like this are taking place in different circumstances than might be tradition, and I don't know what the attendance is like tonight compared to a physical meeting for this time of year, but we've noticed when we've been doing our online meetings with members and activists in the NEU that the attendances are massively up, and I'll come back to that as well in terms of numbers in a minute. But not only different ways of working, obviously lots of people who are able to be working from home in conditions where perhaps employers might have been hostile to that particular suggestion in the past, and whether the experience of the lockdown might inform an opportunity for workers to debate non-traditional ways of working as we go forward, recognising that the economy was going to be hit in one way or another to the extent that we allow it to be hit, I think, but that the economy would need to look different, particularly in a post-Brexit scenario, when you consider the decimation of manufacturing that we've experienced over the last 40 years. And if you looked at the panic at the beginning of the pandemic around the production of ventilators, of masks, of other PPE, having to ship it in from other parts of the world, competing in a market for PPE when it was a seller's market without any sort of domestic capacity to meaningfully address that, should serve some lessons for the future, not least in terms of investment in new types of jobs, in new types of skills, including green jobs, and a consideration for jobs that have got a climate orientation to them. The concept of money, the relationship between workers and the state, between capital and labour, has changed throughout this crisis. Then paying people to stay at home is a concept that I don't think any of us would have necessarily countenanced. The magic money tree seems to have mushroomed into a forest, doesn't it? And they still haven't really realistically explained how that's going to be paid back. And again, I'll come back to that, because paying it back would look different depending on your perspective. Lots of people, of course, at the beginning, or as we draw towards hopefully the end of the pandemic, are looking at the welfare system in a different way. I know from my previous job with PCS that we see TV shows, we see front page headlines. We see ministerial statements about benefit fraud, of which there's about £1 billion, but there's £16 billion of benefits that go unclaimed every year, and how that relationship might sit with a new tax regime, with how public services themselves are considered, given the role that the care sector has played in the crisis, has to be re-examined. And I think if ever there was an appetite for that to happen, then it's now. You know, millions of us have been out until recently on Thursday evening clapping for emergency services, tapping into some of that appetite amongst people who probably aren't union members. I think provides us with some opportunities. Something around alienation, about what automation might provide in terms of opportunities. The concept of a shorter working week was blamed for losing Labour the election in December last year. It's currently being talked about in serious tones by mainstream economists, and again we need to press home some advantage in that respect. And then finally, in terms of class unity, and really this is what I think encompasses all of the previous comments that I've made, and building class unity does appear in the TUC's national campaign plan. It has for a number of years. Some of you might be surprised to learn now. What the paper tries to do is try to give life to some of those sentiments. Some of you will see that the Labour Party is a route to providing that. Some of us will recognise that there has to be a degree of extra parliamentary activity, if only to ensure that Labour representatives, whether at local authority level or at parliamentary level, are more closely articulating the concerns of their communities in a way that perhaps is less likely now than it was this time last year. And that really leads me to the recommendations in the paper, of which there are 5. They are intended not to be a manifesto necessarily, but to inform the TUC's work plan in the absence of an annual conference this year, which couldn't take place because of the lockdown. And I say there are 5 recommendations, but really there are 2 very, very important ones. First of which is the community organising angle. Trades councils are the community wing of the TUC, and have got a vitally important role to play. Not all of them, not enough of them are as active as yours, and we want to make sure that we put some effort into ensuring that they are re-established where they don't exist, where they're being given new life where they are currently almost moribund, and that we are ensuring that affiliates, every union, meets its responsibilities to encourage branches to breathe new life into those trades councils to ensure that they are truly representative. They can then build alliances with unemployed centres where they exist, with food banks, with residents' associations, and other community groups that will share a determination and perhaps the numbers to try to make a difference as we emerge from the crisis. But based on the second important recommendation, which is that of political education, I don't want to generalise, but I'm not sure how the average food bank worker, whether they're unemployed, whether they're on a low wage, whether they're a single parent, I don't know whether they truly understand the economic brutality that's being meted out to them in economic terms or in political terms. And I think that the movement has got a responsibility to provide some of that political education, not just to its own members and its shop stewards, but to try to project some of that outwards into organisations that might share our aims in changing society in a fundamental way that perhaps might be more possible now. And if it was just going to be easy, they wouldn't call it the struggle. But it just seemed at the very beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown that the foundations were perhaps in place, if we are serious about this and with a serious amount of individual and collective effort, to come out of it in a stronger position than that which we went into it, anticipating the type.
Start to wind up, please.
I finished it, anticipating the type of deepening austerity that might make the last 10 years look relatively benign.
Oh, perfect. Sorry about that. All right, thanks very much, Peter. Lots for everybody to get their heads around and engage with there. Can I introduce our next speaker then, Billy Godfrey from Grace Manchester Labour for Green New Deal.
Yeah, cheers, Ian. So Yeah, firstly, I want to provide a bit of, I'm not sure what your awareness is as a group of the Green New Deal as a concept, but I think that it's important to go through a bit of the history, and I hope it will become apparent as I do. But yeah, the Green New Deal was first conceived in the wake of the 2007-2008 global financial crash by Anne Pettifor and some others who, thinking as I'm sure many of us did, that the ensuing global recession would provide an opportunity to decarbonize and transform the global economy. The Green New Deal was, in that sense, based on Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal stimulus package from the 1930s, which itself followed the Great Depression, was during the Great Depression, and consisted of massive public work projects, unprecedented levels of funding for the arts, financial reforms and regulations. Obviously, it goes without saying that the Green New Deal didn't mimic the original New Deal in that sense, in that we didn't have one. But a large part of the reason for that was because it was a new concept and there was no popular movement pushing it from below. In the 13, 14 years since, that's changed. The concept has been popularized initially by the Sunrise Movement in the US, who supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's congressional campaign. And since then, it's spread all over the world. So we've seen DM25 talking about a European Green New Deal. We've seen in the 2019 Labour's General Election Manifesto plans for a Green Industrial Revolution. The Bernie Sanders campaign had its own iteration of a Green New Deal as well. And recently we heard that South Korea will be the first country to actually implement one, although probably not along the lines that we'd hope. So the Green New Deal means different things in all of these contexts. It's what generally is concurrent throughout these ideas is that it's a plan to decarbonize the economy. There's some variations, for instance, whether that's absolute zero or net zero. With Labour for a Green New Deal, for instance, our demands are complete decarbonisation of the economy, the rapid phasing out of fossil fuels, large-scale investment in renewables, a just transition for workers, which is what I'll spend a bit of time on, public ownership of energy and utilities, integrated public transport, supporting the climate transitions of underdeveloped countries, and welcoming climate refugees. With Green New Deal UK, which is a new organisation that I'm also involved with, the demands are a bit more concise. So it's decarbonisation, a just transition for workers, transformation of our economic system, global climate justice. As socialists, total decarbonisation is non-negotiable, a just transition for workers is non-negotiable, and international climate justice is non-negotiable. If a Green New Deal doesn't commit to these demands, then as far as we're concerned, it's not a Green New Deal. The reason why I've gone through that history is because we're about to enter another global recession, the biggest since the 1930s. And yeah, as I've said, unlike in 2008, we have a global movement behind this now. We're much better prepared than we were then, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to be a struggle. If you add to that the coronavirus has turned the logic of the neoliberal state on its head, the largest economies in the world have been shut down for months on end, ours longer than most, and throw into that mix historically low interest rates, mass unemployment. There are opportunities there if we're prepared to fight for them. We can now point to this government and say, which we couldn't have said 6 months ago, if the state is able to intervene so heavily because of coronavirus, then it can intervene heavier still for the climate crisis. As Andreas Malm has argued, we need an ecological Leninism, and we need unions to be the vanguard of that movement. If unions aren't present in the climate struggle, then firstly, we're not going to win it, and secondly, it wouldn't be worth having if we did. So the role of trade unions in that, and in the post-coronavirus context, the relationship historically has been quite fraught between unions and the climate justice movement. There's been an obvious lack of class politics in the climate justice movement, and that extends today into XR as well. And the climate justice movement has in turn viewed trade unions as a barrier to progress. This is starting to change, specifically with Labour for a Green New Deal. We are avowedly socialist in a way that SERA, for instance, aren't. They dropped the socialism from their name a long time ago. And there's a whole new generation of climate strikers, of young working class kids who are fighting for a green economy. There's obviously still some tensions. We saw it last year at Labour Party conference with the GMB. Although the motion that Labour for a Green New Deal took to conference from 128 CLPs was overwhelmingly supported by the Fire Brigades Union, Unite, Unison, the Bakers Union, there were some sticking points with GMB, which is absolutely to be expected, given that they represent workers in the aviation industry in particular. That led to two different motions passing on the conference floor. One with the 2030 decarbonisation date, one with no decarbonisation date, which was GMB's. And we bear some responsibility for that. What we didn't do as a climate justice movement was adequately convince GMB and its members that a just transition was in place and that the jobs and livelihoods of its members would be secure throughout that. And that's what we have to do better at. Given the choice between a job that you have now and a job that you might have in the future, which one are you going to choose? It makes sense. But realistically, it's impossible to imagine a post-carbon future without a vastly reduced aviation industry, without the complete elimination of the fossil fuel industry. And there's a conversation about nuclear that we can have as well. So what we need to do as a climate justice movement and as trade unionists is secure absolute guarantees for a just transition, to make sure that no working person is left behind and that working people are really driving this movement itself. I'm going to give a few examples of how we can do that. Obviously, it requires us as unionists being at the forefront of the climate justice movement. So yeah, if we think about fossil fuel industry, steel and cement production, these industries are going to be the most affected. So we need to be working with workers in those industries now on securing reskilling packages, securing wage guarantees over a number of years. So if we look at the Bernie Sanders campaign, which obviously failed this year, one of his policy recommendations for a just transition for workers was 5 years of full pay while workers undertook reskilling at no cost to themselves. That's obviously an incredible policy. It's also obviously not going to happen because he lost. We now have at least 4 more years of Tory government. Who knows? Presuming this Parliament lasts the duration, but we don't know. But we don't need to have these policies handed down to us by politicians. We can win them for ourselves. So if we look at the Oil, Chemicals and Atomic Workers Union from the US, they promoted taxation of polluting chemicals and processes to finance the redeployment and protection of their workers. That strategy has now been adopted by the American Federation of Labour and Congress of International Organisations as their official environmental policy. So some of the things that workers secured for themselves were a 2-year notification on site closures and scalebacks, funds to develop alternative technologies and jobs for dislocated workers with full wages and benefits until employment or retirement, 4 years of tuition and maintenance grants to retrain, post-education stipends if no job with comparable wages were available, and relocation support for workers displaced by losses to their industry. There is a precedent for workers winning these things themselves. We need to make sure we're at the forefront and we're making it happen, because it's not going to be handed down to us, least of all by this government. What's really important then is that we view, as difficult as it is, we view the current pandemic as an opportunity for a green recovery. It's an opportunity for us to reinvest in the deindustrialized towns of the north of England, to re-energize these communities, to bring back jobs where they've been taken away, tackle the flight of young people from provincial towns into cities through lack of opportunity. On the other side of the furlough scheme that Pete's been speaking about, we're looking at potentially record unemployment. Young people will be particularly affected in that. There's going to be some sort of political solution to this crisis, but we can't leave it to the market. We need to organise for these. We need to win. It's not going to be given to us. And similarly, decarbonisation is going to happen one way or another. We need to make sure it's on our terms. So I've got a few practical recommendations for what we as trade unionists can do to aid a green recovery and to win a Green New Deal, with some examples from elsewhere. So Stephen Hale, who formerly of Green Alliance, says that unions hold the key to mobilising public concern, behaviour and political change in the struggle against climate change. Individual action on the scale necessary will only emerge through collective decisions in networks and communities with which people have strong personal affiliations and which can give them the motivation and opportunity to act. That's completely true. We need to ask ourselves all the time how we can deepen our engagement with the struggle for climate justice. So some things we can do as trade unionists. We need union reps to lead change in our organisations. Among our colleagues, If your branch doesn't have a green coordinator or a climate committee, why? Can you conduct audits of existing skills and infrastructure within your workplaces with the greatest potential for green job transitions? The TUC did a great green workplace project a few years ago on this. Again, as Peter was saying, can we hold political education events on climate justice? Another thing that's important for us to remember as well is that so many of our members are already working in low carbon industries. So many people who work in health and social care sector, those are low carbon jobs, and we should think of them as such. We should always be sure, as we always are, to defend those jobs and to extend those jobs. Some other examples from elsewhere. So I've already spoken about the Oil, Chemicals and Atomic Workers Union. The US Blue-Green Alliance is a collective of 6 million workers across some of America's largest labor unions and its most influential environmental organizations. And they work to solve environmental challenges in a way that create and maintain jobs to build a fairer economy. If we look at Spain, unions and government have an agreement to ensure that workers participate in the implementation of environmental regulations, representation rights on workplace environmental issues, and sectoral bodies to address the impact of climate change.
Billy, could you start to bring your remarks to a conclusion?
Absolutely. Yeah, and then finally, we have to think as well about, we may not have another chance to get into government for another 4 years. Even if we do, we don't know how amenable a Labour government under this leadership is going to be to climate justice. We don't know how seriously they're going to take this, the scale of the severity of the crisis that we face. So what we can do in the interim is hold our local authorities to account. We can develop local prescriptions for a Green New Deal and a green recovery, and we can put them into practice on a municipal level. In America as well, we've seen that direct action gets the goods in the last few weeks. We must engage in it often, and our demand should be big. And outside of our unions, join Labour for a Green New Deal, join Green New Deal UK, join climate justice organisations that have good class politics at their heart. If you want to know how, get in touch. I'll be happy to help out. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Billy. Again, a huge amount covered in that talk. So as there's quite a lot of us in the meeting, there are 31 of us in at the moment, what we're going to do is just break up into breakout rooms just for 6 minutes. So what I'd ask everybody to do is in those rooms, you'll have about 5 of you in each room, is just go round and everybody introduce themselves and say one observation or one question they've got relating to the topic this evening. Welcome back, everybody. I think that's everybody back. Hopefully we haven't lost too many people in the process. Sometimes we do. One thing I was just going to say, comment on, certainly from the group I was in, a few people were asking which union should I join, and certainly you know, it'd be great if more people who are active and politically engaged were in unions and helping organise them. I'm going to post a link in the chat box, which is the TUC's Union Finder, which is a tool to help you find an appropriate union, because in general, if you're in a workplace, you want to join the union. If workmates are in a union, you want to join that one, because a union, at the end of the day, it's about sticking together with your colleagues. It's not about, you know, what head office says or what the policies are or whatever. Fundamentally, it's about that solidarity at a workplace level. If you're in an ununionized workplace, then you want to look for, well, which are the unions which organise my industry, or maybe other parts of the same employer, or, you know, similar industries if you can't find one. But hopefully that tool will help, and if it doesn't, certainly get in touch with Trades Council. We can help point you in the right direction if that doesn't. So I'm going to open it up now to general discussion. I'm sure there's probably quite a few thoughts that have come out in the smaller groups that people may want to raise in the wider group.
Frank Ellis, Transport Salary Staffs Association. I think the key thing is that the government is already planning austerity, because they're looking at getting rid of the triple lock for the state old age pension. Whether they'll get away with this is another matter. But you do need more expansionary, Keynesian sort of things, and the Green New Deal would fit in very well with that, because the economy will be very flat after this, and a lot of unhealthy parts of the economy will be finished off through this. That's my contribution.
Thanks, Frank. Mandy.
Okay, thanks. I don't know, I felt quite frustrated that there wasn't more of a unified approach by the unions. It felt to me as a little bit like as if all of the responsibility had been pushed onto the shoulders of head teachers. And I'm not sure, there was a bit of a piecemeal approach, it seemed to me, with how much consultation was being done with the actual staff and the parents as to how comfortable they felt about the easing of lockdown, you know, including cleaning staff and catering staff as well, who might have a lower status within that organisation and not feel able to express their concerns. So it feels as if an opportunity to get ahead with collectivism has passed us by. I wanted us to go back into this easing of lockdown with a clear rejection of some of this that seems to have happened too soon, and that hasn't happened. So my question would be, is it too late now for us to grab hold of that? And if not, what is the best way that councils and unions can work together with, you know, the left in or outside of the Labour Party to try and push a common agenda?
Thanks, Mandy. I've got Sarah next.
Hello. Yes, it's kind of similar really to what Mandy's saying about, so I'm a freelance forest school practitioner, so I'm self-employed. I'm considering joining the new teaching union, but anyway, I just finding a union at the minute that's going to suit. But the two groups that I've noticed, one is a group of people who are sewing PPE voluntarily and creating thousands and thousands of pieces of PPE from donated fabrics, trying to have a conversation with them about work and getting together, and are they getting their needs met, and they've done all this stuff voluntarily, and now they're getting requests, like formal requests from settings for them to provide this PPE. And that links into was it Pete talking about did we miss the thing about making stuff, manufacturing here in Britain? And then the other thing is, in the forest school community, the freelancers are now realizing the weakened position they're in, because we can't, I'm getting back to work now. We're explicitly said that we can't take groups of children out currently by the government, so everybody's basically facing unemployment. But they're now, I can see them getting together, this is nationally, and talking about setting up maybe a co-op, or setting up under the Institute for Outdoor Learning, which is just a subscription service. And I just think, God, that's just a brilliant opportunity to, of some other kind of organising, but I don't know. So what I'd appreciate is some kind of conversation with people that then I can feed in to those groups if I've got those ears. I did a little bit of the Jane McAlevey training, and that answered some of my questions, but I didn't complete the course. But yeah, it's how do you feed into those conversations to get that unity and that collectivism going.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got Layla next. Are you able to unmute yourself, Layla?
Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. I work in Debenhams in the city centre in Manchester, and I suppose I just wanted to raise the question of job cuts, because that is going to become more and more important, I think. I'll just say very quickly what's happened with Debenhams. So they went into administration for the second time this year, and during the pandemic, when everybody was worried sick about losing loved ones, they closed 11 stores in Ireland, cutting 2,000 jobs. But what happened immediately after that, almost immediately, was the workers started protesting. They were doing social distance protest outside stores, and then eventually a union officially got involved, and they had a ballot, and they took strike action, and they were blocking the loading bays because they wanted to stop the company from taking out millions of pounds worth of stock from inside the stores, because the company was saying, we're not going to pay you anything, any redundancy package you have to claim from the government. That was just one of the things that angered the workers. But they've actually, 2 months on, they've actually, KPMG have backed off now, which is absolutely amazing. But what this company has done to the rest of the stores that they kept open was that they closed departments within the stores. So that's affected my store as well. So that's meant another 4,000 job cuts. Again, during the pandemic, when people were anxious at home, in lockdown, people got sent a text message to say, attend a conference call the next day, and nobody knew what conference call was going to be about. And store managers just read out a script, and people were told that's the end, that you've been made redundant. So everyone's really, really angry. I think, you know, what's happened in my store is that we've started to ask people to put their names to a letter. And so we've got 50 names so far from people from Trafford Centre store, from my store, from Blackburn, Oldham, and there's more names being added, or as time goes on. So I mean, you know, that's just the start of it. So I think that what happened in Ireland is a really, really good example of that. You know, the anger bursting through the fear of not being able to do anything about, you know, what's happening, and the job cuts situation. I think that's just going to get worse. Just one thing, that Debenhams now is owned by huge entities like Barclays Bank, and so the question that they don't have any money, it's just ridiculous. You know, they made 44 billion profit last year when they said the economy was going down. So yeah, those are things that we have to highlight. And we are going to send a letter to Lucy Powell, the MP, as well. So we'd appreciate any backing from Registered Trades Council if there's any way that you could do that as well.
Yeah, well, thanks, Layla. I mean, obviously, if there's anything we can do to help, get in touch. I'm presuming you're in Usdaw, are you? But
Yes.
certainly, I think the Manchester Usdaw branch, from memory, is affiliated. So you should have a route through to the Trades Council quite easily there. Nick.
Hello. Yes. Yeah, I think people have raised the point about the fact that, well, you know, the cost of this crisis is going to be visited on working class. I think that's a really important point. But I think that is, you know, we're going to see massive austerity, massive attacks. But I think that is going to cause a lot of radicalization, and there's going to be a big opportunity to kind of surge forward in industrial organizing. We're already seeing loads of people join trade unions. But I think, you know, we have to be very clear. I think what's important is the kind of political goals we're agitating for, and the kind of solution to this crisis. I think it really has to be what draws, you know, the coronavirus pandemic together, and the climate crisis, and, you know, the kind of massive recession that we're facing as well, is the necessity for public ownership across, you know, key industries and the banks, workers' control, and economic planning. You know, I think this is the only way, if we want to actually adequately fund health services, public services, you know, provide full employment, transition to a sustainable economy. I think this really has to be the kind of things we're agitating for, and the kind of program that we're raising, you know, and the program that we're linking to each kind of industrial struggle that we fight. You know, we need to eliminate capitalism and establish a socialist planned economy. And I think as well, it's never been easier to raise these demands. You know, with the coronavirus pandemic, when we had, you know, we had lack of access to healthcare resources, and, you know, massive problems with food distribution and things. It's actually really easy to say, look, if we want to provide PPE, we need to requisition the companies which produce it. Also, you know, if companies can't afford to keep on their workforce, you know, we should nationalize them. If bosses aren't, you know, introducing health and safety measures, we should put workplaces under workers' control by, you know, committees elected in the workplace. You know, if we wanted to transition to sustainable production whilst keeping jobs, retaining full employment, we need to actually own the industries and the banks to be able to put all that wealth to use. And I think we as well need to break from, like, Keynesianism, which your comrade mentioned. You know, we can't borrow and spend our way out of this crisis. That's actually what the Tories are doing. The Tories have, you know, embarked on a massive program of debt-funded spending. But the bill for that is all going to be placed at the feet of the workers, as long as, you know, the principal industries remain in private hands. So, you know, I think that's the kind of aim. That's the kind of aim that we should be fighting for. And, you know, actually looking at going beyond the bounds of capitalism, breaking from capitalism, and instituting a kind of socialist planned economy, and, you know, having that political aim at the heart of our trade union movement, and also the heart of our Labour Party as well, is really important.
Thanks, Nick. I'll take Evan next, and then Cheryl.
Oh, hi, yeah, yeah. Just a couple of things. Firstly, to Layla, I think. I mean, I'm glad you're in Usdaw and that your branch is affiliated to the Trades Council. Well, it would also be really great if you know, if you could, if your branch could send a delegate, that would be absolutely brilliant, because I think it's. And you know, and you're obviously doing some great work there, and I think we will do everything we can. I'll reiterate what Ian says to support that. In terms of what Billy said, yeah, I mean, I was really impressed by was a very thorough understanding, recognition, and analysis of what some of the mutual problems are between historically between the environmental movement as a whole and the trade union movement. You know, the recognition of the the essential interconnection between both. But obviously also recognizing that doesn't just happen automatically, and that there are issues that need to be whole sorts of issues. And I actually like this idea of union branches having a a green officer or whatever you call it. I mean, that's actually worth thinking about. I mean, I'm in the Unite Community branch, so we're not a branch of working people, but we actually do have an environmental subcommittee. In fact, I noticed that one of the convener of it is actually here as well, Bev. So perhaps I should let her say more about that if she wants to, without putting you on the spot there, Bev. As far as what Pete had to say and the document that he was speaking to, yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent document, and I think Pete's, and I think it touches on so many really, really important things. But as Pete himself said, we do need to, it's just words on paper unless something is done to put things into practice. And just a couple of questions to Pete. One. We do need, I mean, you said some very nice things about our Trades Council, but, as a person on the Trades Council who's responsible for increasing affiliation, I really do want to have a dialogue with TUC, Northwest TUC, about how they can help, and regional unions about how they can help us do that. And one final question is, in terms of what role do you see for the People's Assembly in all of this? Because again, this is an important partner of trades councils and of the TUC.
Thanks, Evan. I'll take Cheryl next, and then I'll throw in a few comments, and then there's quite a few more people who've got their hands up now.
I think the point that you've made around political education is really important across both fronts, but I think the other issue I have is around upskilling our communities to feel like that they have, for example, in the area that I work, we've had we have a particular area of that is sort of well known for social deprivation, and want to represent on sort of the multidisciplines that are on that, so social care, education, health, but the actual people that live in the community are not represented there. And I like that, and I think it's around our communities feeling like they've got that they can, empowering them is around giving them the skills to have the opportunity to talk for themselves. So young people and the families that I work with, a lot of them have speech, language and communication needs, and they're not upskilled to be able to do that. We're all here as a community of people that can advocate for ourselves, but actually surely we've got a duty to give people that voice, to make them feel that they can be heard and that they can take their fight forward, because the education lot facilitating that. And I say that with nearly 2 decades of working within that system across and seeing support comes where it's gone back home. Now I have young people in the youth justice system. So yeah, I think we've got a duty to sort of represent that agenda as well, about giving ourselves the skills to take this forward. Not just us.
Thanks, Cheryl. Hopefully people could make out most of that. The line was quite bad, but I think we could get the gist. So thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say something about what the government's likely to do next, because I think there's an assumption that it will simply be another round of austerity. And I don't think from the government's behaviour so far that it's as simple as that. So I think you can see kind of two responses around the world. You can see the austerity response, and you can also see the business stimulus response. And obviously the government's trying to do both. But the stimulus that they're giving is very focused on business. It's often destructive in terms of society and the environment. It's often racist in terms of who gets the benefits. It doesn't protect the people at the bottom of the pile. And I think it's quite likely, if you look at how the government tries to promote kind of culture war type politics, that they would try to, on the one hand, do some stimulus to encourage certain industries that are maybe making large donations to the Tory party or helping the city or whatever, but at the same time trying to pit people against each other in terms of who gets access to benefits. More attacks on migrants. You can see how they could try and ramp up the scapegoating as well. I had a couple of questions in relation to the Northwest TUC paper, Peter. So it seems to suggest that because unions have had a more kind of mainstream role during the crisis, that there's a possibility of more favourable legislation. That seems a bit far-fetched to me. I mean, despite the fact we've had union growth and more influence during the crisis, it seems to me that that's been more about the government wanting political cover for decisions it's taking that it knows are very risky. So it wants the TUC to kind of share the blame for what happens, rather than genuinely, suddenly having a conversion on the road to Damascus. And we can see the right of the Tories being incredibly hostile, and particularly to the teaching unions over the attempts to stop schools reopening before it's safe. Demands for more attacks on unions' ability to collect subs through payroll, things like that. So that seemed a bit optimistic to me, to be brutally honest. And then on the practical side of it, it talks about trades councils doing community organising. And I must admit, whenever I read the words community organising, a slight shiver runs down my spine, because it's one of these phrases that everybody bandies around these days, but people don't specify what it means. Now, real community organising is very resource intensive. You've got to really dig roots into particular communities. Manchester Trades Council, you're very complimentary about us, but we don't have the capacity to do genuine community organising across Manchester. We had a brief discussion about this on the exec a couple of weeks ago. We'd love to, but we don't have that capacity. The most we can do in that respect is building solidarity, kind of amplifying campaigns and actions that other people are doing, giving solidarity where we can, and trying to connect up, if you like, trade union movement with community activism as strongly as we can. And finally, on that point, I've just been partway through reading Jane McAlevy's latest book, A Collective Bargain, and she's talking in there about the kind of conflict and distrust between environmental movements and unions. And her argument is that to win on climate, we have to get workers on board. There's just no way we're going to win without mass collective action by workers, the scale of transformation that's needed. But there's been a tendency by environmentalists to focus on, if you like, the most contentious issues. So in Manchester, lots of us have complained about the council bailing out the airport employers rather than helping convert the jobs there to green jobs. And I'm one of the people that's complained about that, don't get me wrong. But that if we want to win on this, we're going to have to demonstrate that we can actually deliver good green jobs, not just talk about it. So campaigning on the issues where there's common ground, whether it's about trying to renovate all the housing in Manchester, trying to have free public transport for everybody in Manchester, massively expanded, those kind of things, where we could actually win good quality green jobs, would do more to actually shift and undermine those fears that a lot of workers have, that environmentalists talk about a just transition, but actually it's not really a priority. And I thought that was quite interesting. Anyway, back to other people. I'll take Chris next.
Hi, thanks. Sorry I'm from the gloom. There's something up with my camera.
This is mainly addressed at Peter. I was very pleased to hear what you said about encouraging and developing trades councils, but I think I'm going to be a bit echoing the point that Evan made. There is a problem getting trade unions to see the collectivisation that trades councils can help with in terms of bringing them together at the level of the town and the city. And I think there's quite a lot of work to be done to convince effectively regional secretaries to get their unions to be genuinely enthusiastic about trades councils. I mean, much as I'm very pleased about what Manchester's been able to achieve over the last, is it about 5 years now, something like that, it's still on quite a thin delegate basis, certainly active delegate basis. And I think the problem's even a bit bigger than that, because I mean, in 2018 and I think 2017, I was on the Northwest TUC, and I definitely had the impression that the regions of the unions weren't even particularly interested in that either. So I think the problem is not even at a trades council level, but is in fact there's a weakness of a sense of inter-trade union solidarity right through the movement. And no matter what a little trades council does, or I think even the Northwest TUC's executive or whatever, I think there's difficulties unless we can really go at, I suggest, regional secretaries to encourage that participation that we need.
Thanks, Chris. I'll take Bev next and then Roderick.
Right, yeah, I mean, I think my contribution is a lot more sort of basic, because I feel we've got to have some hope in how things have got to change in our direction, because if we don't organise and if we don't make links with allies, we're not going to manage to do that. I think, in the past, like, austerity has been possible to implement because they've been able to scapegoat people so easily. Now the number of unemployed has doubled just in 3 months, and it's probably going to go higher. I know someone that's in the private sector, they furloughed people, now they're making 20% redundancies. I'm sure that's going on across the board. I don't know if anyone's got figures on the extent of where furloughing is turning into redundancy, but there is going to be a lot of people, there's going to be a much bigger pool of resistance, and I think there's got to be much more generalisable messages to go out there to people, so that we're not on this sort of sectoral situation that we were in before. I mean, I'm retired, but I'm in Unite the Community. At the moment, we're getting training about universal credit, and also we've got links with Manchester Law Centre and around things like rent. So I just think there are a lot of issues which will basically span across different workplaces, which will affect everybody from that point of view. If you look at Black Lives Matter, you wouldn't have expected such a massive turnout, 10,000 people last Saturday before, all very energised about what had happened in America. And I just think that, there's so many people that are going to be affected by what's happened, that there are going to be the opportunities to make those links between different allies. And I agree, you can't just, what Ian was saying about the community organising angle of it, it sounds a bit sort of optimistic to say, well, we'll link with food banks and then we'll have community organising and then we'll have, but we haven't got that yet. But those things are all in existence and we should be making those links. And when things are lifted more, I think it's going to, hopefully, we've got to make sure it unleashes a lot of enthusiasm.
Thanks, Bev. So Roderick next, and then I'll bring Layla back in.
Yeah, so I'm feeling a bit like an interloper here because I'm down in London and I'm a Unite Housing rep. I'm a rep at a housing association in Hackney. And I joined this discussion because I like the title. Now, the discussion's been very, I think, and understanding being very practical, I think, in terms of, you know, the sort of work that needs to be done in people's different areas and so on. But I mean, I guess I'm kind of following from Bev slightly. I was sort of half listening to her because I was kind of thinking of my contribution at the same time. So I got the gist of what she was saying. But I want to think in terms of big picture terms and how we link everything together as well. Because I think we are in a period now where we are facing potentially the biggest period of crisis, multiple crises since Second World War at least. I think in that situation, we're going to be having a situation, there's going to be massive levels of struggle, definitely internationally, quite possibly here, over a range of issues, potentially simultaneously. And Black Lives Matter is a portent of that. So the question then that emerges in my head is, what's the political leadership that's going to emerge out of this? And where's it going to come from? I mean on a national scale. It's worth us thinking about this, because then the question about what we thought about where it's likely to come from is, what do we do to make it, to help bring it into being? Because it will just come automatically. I think it has to be actually built. And I don't think it'll come from the trade unions in itself, although I think they're going to be playing a very useful and very important role. I don't think it'll come from the Labour Party. I think we've tried that route of trying to make it into a left-wing organisation, and I was one of the ones that was quite optimistic about Corbyn when he first got elected. But I think there are really, really deep structural reasons why that sort of project just can't succeed. I don't think it's going to come magically out of nowhere, you know, from the movement itself. It's going to be something, probably involving a break from existing organisations in some description. But what will it be, and how can we help bring it about? And that's a very open question, but I think it's something I want people to think about, because I think it's an important question.
Thanks, Roderick. At the moment, I can just see Layla indicating. If nobody indicates while Layla's speaking, I will ask Peter and Billy if they want to come back in before we wrap the meeting up. Oh, I've got Nick as well, but if anyone else wants to come in, we have got a little bit of time still. Just indicate while Layla's speaking. Layla.
Okay. It is that there are tons of problems. I mean, my union, USJOR, the branch that I'm in, God, where do I start? I mean, it's a geographical branch, K125, which means that it covers a really vast area, including Rochdale, Oldham, Bolton, really the whole of, you know, a vast area, but they haven't had a branch meeting in a long time, and I have pestered and pestered and pestered to try and get one to happen, and especially during lockdown. I thought that was, you know, that they would do it, but there is real resistance from regional secretaries and so on, and that they don't want members to become, you know, it's the age-old thing, isn't it? They want us subs, but they don't really want us to be organising and doing stuff, really. I mean, an example of this is Tesco. So Tesco does have a recognition agreement. We do have USJOR has recognition with Tesco's, but there were job cuts that happened last year, and during the pandemic, when something like 40 thousands of people were taken on by Tesco's to deal with the increase in demand, but they were all on temporary contracts and things like 12-hour contracts. Most of those have been let go now, and in addition to that, they also made job cuts of permanent staff. So in the bakeries in Tesco's up and down the country, there were job cuts, and the union just nodded and accepted it and didn't fight. So I think that. And people are incredibly angry, and I think, but when Bev was talking about the pool of resistance, that is going to grow as people become more angry. And I think that, you know, one of the slogans perhaps we have to be putting out there is, we're not going back to how things were before lockdown. You know, the increase in homelessness and people relying more and more on food banks. People don't want that, and I think that Trades Council has to be trying to relate to what's going on, to the movements that start to emerge, like Black Lives Matter, and anything that happens. It's a bit like we are, when there's nothing happening and you feel that you are not relevant, but when stuff starts to happen, people will come to Trades Council, if that makes sense. They'll come because you need solidarity at those times. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry.
No, don't apologise. Thanks very much. Nick.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on, I think it was Roderick's point. I think it's really, really a very important point, the point about political leadership, because I think that we do have a massive crisis of leadership, you know, across the working class at the moment, which, you know, he also drew attention to the fact that we're in the biggest crisis that capitalism has ever seen, by, you know, you could easily argue that. And I think that means that we are really in a revolutionary period. And, you know, 2019 saw a massive wave of uprisings around the world. We've seen the Black Lives Matter uprising in the US. And, you know, that kind of energy is going to come to Britain as well. But without a kind of a really strong leadership with a really clear, sorry, my internet's going a bit. Sorry. Without a
Nick,
sorry,
did I take the next speaker and you come back in a moment? Are you having some technical difficulties?
Can you hear me better now? Or?
Yes, yeah, you're fine. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah. I think without a really strong leadership with a really clear political program, and I think that needs to be a Marxist political program, you know, based on winning power for the working class and introducing a socialist planned economy, we're not going to get anywhere. But, you know, those movements will fizzle out due to kind of exhaustion and fatigue. But I think in terms of how we build that leadership, we have to recognize that the organizations like trade unions and the Labour Party are going to be massively shaken up by the movements which are on the horizon and the movements which are happening right now. So we can't forsake any of those arenas. You know, we have to organize in the Labour Party to raise Marxist ideas, to raise the program, and to try and build that organization. Because, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people organized in the Labour Party, and it represents hundreds of thousands of more trade unionists. So if we want to build the leadership, you know, we have to organize as socialists in the Labour Party and in the trade unions, and, you know, democratize them, turn them into fighting outfits. But what's really important is the political program. You know, what are we fighting for? What kind of society are we fighting for? How do we, you know, solve the crisis of capitalism? So we need to, you know, get educated about how capitalism works, why we can't reform it, why we need to build workers' power. And that's the kind of perspective that we need to organise on, in my opinion.
Thanks, Nick. So the last speaker before I bring Peter and Billy back in will be Mandy.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that we know that there's mass unemployment on the horizon as furlough tapers, and a lot of more businesses go out of business. I think, I'm not sure nobody knows what's going to happen and how this is going to unfold, or if we're going to have even another wave of the virus and another lockdown. So all we can really deal with is where we're at currently and presently. I'm not sure whether the solution to this is going to be possible within parliamentary politics, and that probably sounds like a weird thing for me to say as someone who is within the Labour Party, you know, as a councillor. It's dawning on people what we're facing and what we're looking at and how transformational that's going to be, really negatively, or we can try and get ahead of it and take some kind of positive action and acknowledge it rather than, you know, go into denial and pretend it's not happening. So I think that there will be big themes that we can engage the public on, and we can work more closely with the public on, alongside unions. You know, there will be big overarching themes that are bigger than any political party that currently exists, that we can actually start to make some headway on. And I think that's going to be the trick to it, because we're going to need collectivism across councils, and across the unions and across all of the left, and we're going to need to unify and get over our petty differences in order to actually win on this, because this is probably the biggest opportunity that we've had to make the case for socialism, or, you know, Marxism, whatever it is, to reverse really rampant profiteering that has wrecked the working class in this country. The problem, obviously, that a lot of the working class have been, the scapegoating has got to people, and so, you know, you have that to contend with as well. But I think that the left has instinctively sensed that people who've been actively involved in it have instinctively sensed that this is the time now to really take political education seriously. I'm involved in a group. We can't roll it out any wider until those of us that are in the group learning understand some of these theories a lot more clearly. But we are, but those wheels are in motion. So I think there's a lot of hope. I would like to keep in touch with people, if anyone wants to like friend up on Facebook or whatever.
Thanks, Mandy. So just before I bring Peter in, a couple of practical announcements. I've posted in the chat box, if you're not already on Manchester TUC's email list, you can sign up through our website, which is manchestertuc.org.uk. So I'd encourage people to get on that email list so we can let you know about both events we're organising, but also campaigns, solidarity, disputes and so on that we can unite around. And also the Trades Council is planning next month to have a public meeting, but based around Black Lives Matter. So in particular, looking about how we can help bring some of the issues raised more strongly into workplaces. So already that's happening, where people are demanding employers tackle discrimination, but also there's all the issues around the higher death rate for Black and ethnic minority people around COVID, and in education a lot of issues about decolonising the curriculum. So there's certainly plenty to talk about, but we need to make sure this isn't just a flash in the pan but brings about permanent change. So that'll be a good discussion. I hope lots of you will join next month. So Peter, if you could just have 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot there, and I'm not going to be able to get back to everybody who's raised very, very legitimate questions and observations in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best to, I think, concentrate on the ones which I think are particularly apposite and seem to come up more than once, and I'll do my best to answer the direct questions that people ask me as well. So Cheryl, Bev, Rod, Nick and Mandy all raised questions around organising in communities and the crisis in the structural crisis that might be required in politics, might be required for us to generate that structural crisis in politics to make the types of leap forwards that I think is necessary. And I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and I'm not criticising anybody for being in the Labour Party. I think your fortitude in sticking with that project through thick and thin is something to be admired, but the product of our community organising has to be creating the conditions where the leader of the Labour Party isn't triangulating for a electorally advantageous position on a weekend when the far right are taking over the capital city, that leads to him coming out and supporting proposals such as 10 years in prison for throwing an egg at a statue of Winston Churchill. He's only allowed to get away with that because he takes the votes of working class communities, housing estates in South Manchester and Liverpool and Blackpool for granted. And if those communities can be organised to the extent where he's under pressure, like the community in Bristol did when they threw that rope around Edward Colston, then that is going to be the only thing that drags the mainstream Labour Party into a type of position where it's reflecting the concerns that I think we've articulated tonight. And the political education that we're trying to deliver, I had a meeting last week with some of the tutors from the trade union education units and Tony Saunders, who heads up TUC education for the TUC in the Northwest. I've set them a brief to come up with a Marxist syllabus that they're not in any doubt about what it is that we've asked for. There will be a bit of Friedman and Keynes in there, but it'll be Marxist in its conclusion. So I hope that's some reassurance. And you know, that's not difficult. Sorry, that's not easy in the TUC, but we have got ourselves into that position. There was also something I wanted to just mention on the dilemma between trade unionists and the Green movement, but I think it's probably best to leave that to Billy to come back to, other than to say that for me, I see this as being the anti-apartheid struggle of the 21st century. In 30 years' time, people will claim they were on the right side of that debate, even if they weren't, and some unions have got to grasp that. On Trades Council affiliation, which was mentioned by Chris, Evan and Ian, I mean, I take the criticism of the union bureaucracy on the chin as a member of the union bureaucracy. John Morgan's on the call now, our secretary in Manchester. He will vouch for the fact that we've tried to push Trades Council affiliation through our union. I mean, the response that we get largely, other than for a handful of good exceptions like John are actually to say that they're too busy. And when I talk to regional secretaries, they say, oh, if I go out and ask them to do something else, I'll get lynched because they're pulled from pillar to post as it is. Now, the good ones are saying that genuinely, but based on the fact that there are too few people active in the unions to share the work out in a manageable way, and therefore everybody on the call has got a responsibility to play the maximum part in their union to free up time to spend on the extracurricular stuff like this. The more reactionary regional secretaries that might have been around 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when I was on the Trades Council, I think they've largely gone at the moment. And I'm not suggesting that we're all on the same page, but the regional secretaries that I work with are a good bunch and would try, I think, to work along the lines that we're discussing here if they thought that their work would fall on fertile ground. So there's perhaps a mutual responsibility there. Same goes for People's Assembly. I'm not ignoring a question from Evan. I think the same applies to People's Assembly. Do we need another vehicle? I thought it served a really useful purpose at the time. It probably suffered from the enthusiasm around the Corbyn phenomenon and the fact that the Labour Party suddenly appeared to be a more fruitful avenue for people's activity. I think it probably can be born again, but it'll take time. It's certainly got a role to play, I think, as things develop. Particularly Ian's question about the paper. I wasn't suggesting that we are in a better position to actually persuade government to accede to our demands on things like collective bargaining. What I was trying to describe was that amongst our own ranks, perhaps the opportunity exists to build a type of confidence that might be necessary to force that home, peacefully if we may, but it's not going to be done peacefully, forcibly if we must. But we've got to build confidence, I think, on our own side to progress that in a way that is likely to bear fruit. And then finally, on the general question of austerity, which lots and lots of people mentioned, Cheryl, Layla, Nick and Frank, about what it is that's about to be meted out to us. All I would say is, and I mentioned it in my opening about the relationship between capital and labour, between the state and citizens, the concept of money itself, all the hand-wringing that's going on about the recovery, £20 billion has been spent on furlough. Well, I've just, the top 10, so just the top 10 of the Sunday Times rich list have got an accumulated wealth of £150 billion. A 20% tax on the accumulated wealth of those top 10 people would deliver us 30 million quid, 30 billion quid, which would leave us plenty left over to spend on.
Excuse me, wind up so Billy gets a crack.
On anything else that we wanted. And the impact for that would be James Dyson would have to cope with 13 billion quid in the bank rather than 16 billion quid in the bank. If we're serious, the money is there. The cake is big enough. It's just how it's distributed.
Thanks, Peter. That's great. Billy.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really got much more to add. That was excellent from Peter. There's just a couple of things really. As usual, agree with everything that Jane McAlevey says, and obviously needing to have workers on board to win a green recovery and climate justice. I think on what the government's likely to do next, I don't think austerity is necessarily inevitable. In spite of its huge majority, it's shown itself multiple times over the last few months to be incredibly weak, and has also shown itself as an administration to be quite non-ideological. Again, that doesn't happen without a huge movement from below. And again, that's obviously made extraordinarily difficult by draconian anti-union legislation, but we've shown again in the last few weeks that there are wins to be had. The education union, the furlough scheme initially. In spite of that legislation, we can push back on this government, and we can have wins here. The scale of this crisis and the economic crisis that's about to come globally means that it's all on the table and it's all to play for. We just have to be organised and we have to be ready. We don't win a Green New Deal and we don't save the planet and avert climate catastrophe without control of the state. Easier said than done, but everything's on the table.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone that's taken part, and I'm sure both the discussion will carry on, but also more importantly the campaigning will have to carry on, and I think it'll be useful following the discussion tonight. Probably the Trades Council exec needs to have a discussion about what we can do to try to push forward some of the issues we've discussed tonight in terms of trying to strengthen the trade union element in campaigning around climate in particular, for climate jobs. So that's a discussion we can try and take forward. But thanks again, everybody. The meeting has been recorded. If for any reason you don't wish anything you've said to be included in the recording, if you could just drop us an email and we can edit that out before it goes up, or just post in the chat box now, and we can do that. We appreciate sometimes people have employment situations that mean they have to be careful about what goes out publicly. So thanks everybody, and good night.